Hello, good people, and welcome to Hillbilly Cat History. Signed, sealed, remembered, Star Trekkin' Richard Davis. And today we're going to finish off our stories about Richard Davis, including the incident that I've been alluding to, and Richard's Star Trek connections. And we're going to do that by entering this video the same way that Elvis entered a dojo, through the crucible of a warrior. Hi, Marion. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here.
Feel a flame, hammer in hand, carved out his name. 16 and airborne boots in the dirt, jumping through walls, on baptized and hurt. Karate in Japan, fists like steel, champion of honor, deadly and real. Sensei, warriors, no room for doubt. You wear the G or you train and come back. Your eyes a crucible, baby, not a showbiz belt. You bleed, you break, you feel a warrior's belt. Elvis hit the map, but he rolls with a roll. Sneer in his soul, ready for war. It's burning, burning, burning through the pain. Crucible of a warrior, forging Hank's domain. 30 throws, not dances, a fight. Bones to set, boards shattered on sight. Shoot or elbow, fingertip flame. Every strike a prayer, every cater name. 6 weeks of fire, no cameras, no fame. Just sweat and bruises, no more playtime. Saw came in, fist like a stone, said put him down, break ribs if it's known. It's a crucible, baby, not a velvet crown. You fall, you crawl, but you don't stay down. Elvis hit the map, but he rose with the raw. Sneer in his soul, ready for war. It's burning, burning, burning through the pain. Crucible of a warrior, forged in Hank's domain. All eyes watched the king that day. Would he crumble or would he stay? But Hank saw it, war in his eyes. Not a quitter, but a fighter who rise. From Hollywood lights to dojo dust, Elvis earned it not on fame but trust. No stunt, no script, just grit and bruise. Black belt truth, not a headline rule. It's a crucible, baby, not a stage or set. You earn every inch, every beat of sweat. Elvis hit the map, but he rolls with a roar. Sneer in his soul, ready for war. It's burning, burning, burning through the pain. Crucible of a warrior. They burned through the fire, broke through the fear. The dojo legends and kings stood clear. Crucible of a warrior. Elvis was here.
Thank you all for gathering here at Hillbilly Cat History, where we remember together and listen for the echoes. But today, we're going to do more than just hear the echoes and remember. We're not going to just review Elvis history. Today, we're going to make Elvis history, and you're all going to get to be part of it. Those of you here in the live stream and those of you watching in the reruns, make sure that you stay till the end of this video, because we're going to change the Elvis timeline as it's accepted today by most Elvis scholars and fans. And so let's jump into this story, because we've got a lot to cover and only an hour like always. So I'm going to get right into this. We're back with Richard Davis, who we met yesterday, and we know that he joined Elvis in the early 1960s, and the very first film that he was on, that he helped Elvis, that he worked security, was it happened at the World's Fair. And Charlie Hodge says Richard Davis said one night in Hollywood that Elvis had him step into his toilet, talk things over, then offered him a job as one of his personal valets and bodyguards. Now, we heard that story in a lot more detail from Richard himself in yesterday's episode. So if you missed that, be sure to go back into the archive and watch that after we finish this episode. In this picture, we can see Paradise Hawaiian style. And Elvis is in a fist fight. And behind him, you can see Jerry Schilling, who looks very amazed at the fist fight. He's astounded. His attention is on it. Richard Davis is standing next to Jerry. And he looks like this must happen every day. And he's not noticing that there's a fight going on at all. He's very calm. And then in 1965, Richard Davis attended Elvis's wedding. And we've seen this picture before, but we'll just run through the names again real quick. Over at the left, the older gentleman is Harry Levitch, who was Elvis's jeweler from Memphis. He made the wedding rings. He brought them to Vegas. Standing next to Harry, that's Richard Davis. You can see his head just poking out, and next to him is Jerry Schilling. Right in front of them is Joni Esposito, the wife of Joe Esposito, who is Elvis's foreman, is what they would call him. He kind of took care of the books and acted as a go-between between Elvis and the Memphis Mafia as far as handing out duties a lot of times. Joni eventually becomes a Kardashian. Now, behind her is Sandy Schilling, Jerry's wife. You can just barely see her face poking out. And then the younger girl next to her is Michelle, who is Priscilla's sister. And then there's Dee Presley, who is Elvis's stepmother. She's married to Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. The woman next to Priscilla is Priscilla's mother, Ann. And then we've got Priscilla and Elvis and his father, Vernon. And on the front row, starting on the right and moving back to the left, we've got Charlie Hodge, who lived at Graceland until Elvis passed away. You've got Joe Esposito, who's married to Joni, who we just saw. You have Priscilla's father, so that's Ann's husband, and you have Priscilla's brother, Donnie. And that's all the people in this picture, but you can see Richard is one of them. He's one of these people. He's close to Elvis. This is 1967. Probably said that wrong a few minutes ago. It's 1967, the year that we've been looking so closely at. This was on May 1st. And then this is a picture that includes Richard from the making of Speedway. And we've looked at this one before as well, but just to review the people in it, we've got Jerry Schilling over at the far left. We've got Marty Lacker. The man next to Marty Lacker is Larry Jost. He was a craftsman that worked on the set. I think he was sound specifically. And then we've got Elvis, and next to Elvis is Don Sutton, who this was his rookie year. He was a professional baseball player. He really wanted to meet Elvis. He happened to be at the studios, and he met Larry, and Larry brought him over to meet Elvis, and Elvis was kind enough to take this picture with Larry and all the guys. And you got Richard Davis over at the far right. And then in the front, we've got George Klein. He's the man at the left, kneeling down with his eyes closed. George Klein is a lifelong friend of Elvis. He was the president of Elvis's Hume's high school class. And you got Joe Esposito next to George Klein. Hi, Emma. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. We're about to make Elvis history. Hi, Jen. Thank you for being here. Appreciate seeing you. Make sure that you watch this one on the reruns, Jen, because we're about to make Elvis history. And Marion says, it looks like Richard liked to pull pranks. He gave Joe rabbit ears. Yeah, he is. I never even noticed that. That's funny. He is giving Joe rabbit ears. And it looks like Marty's trying to give rabbit ears to George. I wondered what Marty was trying to do. Now that makes sense. And on August 21st, 1967, Elvis completed the looping on Speedway. And after he had lunch, he had makeup tests for the next picture. And on August 22nd, Elvis was released from Speedway. And he was scheduled to begin 2 nights of recording at RCA's Studio A on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. And then an incident occurred. And here's what happened. According to Photoplay magazine, a man named Thomas Wheaton, he's the man who wrote this article, so I'll be referring to him as Thomas. Thomas says the weatherman had predicted rain, and it hovered in the clouds, sometimes almost coming down, and then not. Elvis was on his way to work, but something went wrong. He sensed it as he reported to the set. He didn't feel up to par. It was the final day's shooting. And Alan Fortas, who was a friend of Elvis, he's back on the ranch, running the ranch. That's what we know about Alan Fortas. He's back on the Circle G. He didn't come out here to make Speedway. But what he says is one of the most powerful attorneys in Los Angeles, Ed Hook Stratton, represented half of everybody who was anybody, and he knew the other half personally. Elvis did not have a lawyer in California, and he didn't think he needed one until the day Richard Davis rounded a corner in Bel Air and steered Elvis's station wagon smack into tragedy. In Photoplay magazine, Thomas Wheaton, it says, it was raining outside. As always, the boys, numbering an even dozen of Elvis's buddies from his hometown, they weren't far from his side. Although Elvis has all of them on his payroll, he thinks of them as brothers. They go where he goes. They do what he does. And we can see all of them here in this picture. So Thomas Wheaton is correct. They go where he goes. And Thomas is indicating there's a lot more than we see in this picture, that there's a dozen people that are with Elvis. Thomas says one of them, Red West, married Presley's secretary a year ago. And so that indicates that Red is here for the filming of Speedway. But let's think about that. We're not sure that Red is here. But one of them, Red West, married Presley's secretary a year ago. Elvis was best man. Most of them grew up with Elvis in Memphis. On this day, the Presley boys appeared as happy as ever. Some of them were playing cards outside the dressing room. Others were drinking coffee. Now Elvis was ready to work. The director said, if we can get this in one take, we can be finished with the film by noon. And apparently the director's words were enough to break Elvis's tension. He smiled and even was laughing. And across town in secluded Bel Air, light rain was falling as Harvey Hensley, the gardener, was making his morning coffee break, or taking his morning coffee break. He didn't mind the rain. It only made the flowers and the shrubs greener and more beautiful. And Alan Fortas said Richard had been on the movie set when Elvis decided he needed a couple of pieces of wardrobe from his home. But why would Elvis need a couple of pieces of wardrobe? Well, Thomas says Elvis was summoned to the telephone on the set. It was the publicity department. They wanted publicity photographs. Elvis remembered he didn't have a good pair of slacks, and he didn't have a sports shirt with him. He'd have to send one of the boys to his home to get his clothes. It would take less than an hour, and he could have lunch while he was waiting. And Gunn says this is the final day of Speedway? According to Peter Goralnik, yes. This is the final day of Speedway. In photoplay, Thomas Wheaton says it would take less than an hour and Elvis could have lunch while he was waiting. So Elvis called over to Richard Davis, who was watching a card game. Do me a favor, Elvis said. Take the station wagon. Drive it to the house. Pick up some clothes for me to wear this afternoon. I called the house, so they'll be laid out for you. And the rain had stopped as Richard slid behind the wheel of Elvis's white station wagon. And then a car swings out of control, the tires squeal, the brakes screech. And it's all just in a moment, really. And then a man is dead. A life is taken accidentally, irrevocably. He was not a famous man, but outside of his family and friends, nobody had ever heard of him. But this man had hopes and dreams and plans, and now they were all cut off. And Alan Fortas says, Richard went to get the clothes. And on the way back to the studio, he turned the corner at the exact moment a Japanese gardener, oblivious to traffic, backed out into the street. Richard ran right over him. The gardener was dead. Thomas, he has some more details. He says that Hensley, the gardener, he was busily trimming the hedge when the white station wagon passed him. And he was so engrossed in his work, he took no notice of the car. So what the magazine is telling us is that Elvis lives in this secluded neighborhood in Bel Air. And this gardener is working in that neighborhood. And there's only one way in and out of this neighborhood. So on the way in, Richard passes him in the station wagon. But the gardener doesn't notice the car pass. There's not a lot of traffic here. There's very winding roads that take very sharp turns. And everyone in this area has very tall hedges. These are very expensive houses. And so it's difficult at street level to see around all of the corners and the bends on these streets. And they're somewhat narrow. Hi, Luann. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. And Thomas says, Richard didn't notice the gardener as he drove up the winding and narrow Bel Air road. So neither of them noticed each other, because why would they? Just a gardener going about his day and a man driving on the road. And Thomas says there are no sidewalks in Bel Air, and some of the shrubbery borders the road. Peter Goralnik says on Tuesday, August 22nd, 1967, Richard Davis ran over and killed a Japanese gardener who stepped out from behind a hedge on a curve that screened any view from the road. And Thomas, he picks up the story and says Richard quickly but carefully carried out the first half of his assignment. He placed the shirt and slacks in the car and he prepared for the return trip to Paramount. He never made it back. Peter Guralnick, he says it was too late to notify Felton Jarvis and Jim Malloy, who were already on flights coming into L.A. for the scheduled recording session. But Colonel, sensing that there might be a lawsuit brewing, and wanting at all costs to keep Elvis out of it, he canceled the session, suggesting to Joe that it might be better for them all to get out of town for a few days. Now, this is very important to the timeline, because Peter is saying that because of this event with Richard, the Colonel feared a legal brouhaha or mix-up or public display that Elvis would be blamed for the death of this man. Even though Elvis wasn't in the car, it wasn't Elvis's fault. But his car was involved in this accident. And Peter's saying that was of such public interest that the Colonel chose to cancel the recording session and reschedule them for later in September. And those are the recording sessions where Elvis records Guitar Man with Jerry Reed. So they're very important recording sessions. And Peter is saying the reason they're happening in September is directly because of this event. So he's linked all of these things together for us. And Thomas from Photoplay magazine, he says, only 2 blocks from the house, Richard rounded a curve in the road. And the police summed it up this way. Just as the station wagon rounded the curve, Hensland, for some reason, perhaps to admire his work, stepped back from the hedge onto the road. Richard didn't have time to stop, although he slammed on the brakes with full force. The right headlight of the car plowed into the gardener with a crunch. Suddenly he was flying through the air, his body bouncing with a thud on the pavement yards away. The gardener's clippers had flown high over the hedge. And Luann says this is a terrible tragedy. It is. It absolutely is. And the critically injured man, after Richard had hit him, he's in a coma. So he was rushed to the hospital. And Thomas says his name was Harvey E. Hensland. He was 45 years old. He lived in Glendale, California. He was a man of modest means, a gardener. That is all that is known of him. And someone from the house, from Elvis's house, they called the studio to tell Elvis about the accident. And when Elvis heard, he had 2 questions. And the first one was, is the man alive? And when he was told that the man was in the hospital in critical condition, Elvis burst into tears. And then he asked, how's Richard? And he was told, Richard's shaken up, but he's fine physically. And Elvis said, I'll be right home. Tell Richard not to worry. And Marion says, what a shocking accident. Changes many lives forever. Right, this man has sustained critical injuries and will end up passing away. And Richard's got to live with this for the rest of his life. Even though it wasn't truly his fault, there was nothing he could have done. But Alan Fortis says Colonel knew that Elvis needed somebody sharp to represent him, since it would be a fine line whether Richard acted on his own, going back to the house and fetching the wardrobe, or whether he was acting on Elvis's command. Nobody wanted to cheat the Gardner's family out of a rightful settlement, but Colonel knew that whether Richard was running an errand or simply doing a favor would be an important distinction in court. Enter E. Gregory Hookstratton, otherwise known as Ed. Colonel put him on retainer, beginning an association that would last virtually until Elvis's death, since it would be Hookstratton who would handle Elvis's divorce, and Hookstratton, whose name was bandied about whenever the notion came up to replace Colonel as Elvis's manager. Allen seems to indicate that Colonel brought in a man that Elvis thought might be able to actually replace the Colonel. And that man was Elvis's attorney. And I think we've all heard many times that Elvis had bad legal representation or no legal representation, or Vernon was reading everything himself. Well, we can see here that at this point in time, due to this incident, there is legal representation brought in, at least in California. Now, I think we could assume Elvis already had an attorney in Memphis, in Tennessee. Can't say that for sure, but at least not at this moment. But this is the moment that he gets an attorney in California. And Gunn says, wasn't Elvis's car in good shape then if Elvis was blamed? Yeah, his car was in good shape, but they're explaining that the legal precedent here would have something to do with, was Richard an employee of Elvis's and therefore in the performance of his duties? In other words, like, was he on the clock when he hit the man? If he was, then Elvis could probably be sued for more. If Richard had taken it upon himself to say, you know what, I'm going to go get those clothes for Elvis, but it wasn't part of his actual work performance, and they could argue that successfully in court, although it seems crazy to try to argue it, then if they were sued, if Elvis was sued, maybe he wouldn't have to pay as much. And Luann says that I haven't heard of this accident before. And Emma says that she hasn't either. And Gunn says not her either. And Marion says she hasn't either. Well, that's good that I can bring you guys some new knowledge. This is in Peter Guralnick's book, Careless Love, which is the second of his double biography, 2-volume biography series of Elvis. It was written in 1998. So it was almost 30 years ago. So the story has been available to fans if you happen to read that book and remember the one page that it appeared on. It was much shorter in Peter's version, of course. It's only about a paragraph. So even if you read the book, it's a good chance that you missed this. And Elvis, he called the hospital and he told a nurse, I want to be notified immediately if there's any change in this man's condition. And when Harvey passed away, the hospital telephoned Elvis and they let him know. And Peter Guralnick says Elvis, Joe Esposito, Priscilla, Charlie Hodge, Billy Smith, and Gigi Gamble. Gigi is the man who is married to Patsy Presley, Elvis's double first cousin. And we talked about her in my first live stream earlier today. So if you missed that one, be sure to go back and listen because it's a good story as well. But Elvis, Joe, Priscilla, Charlie, Billy, and Gigi, they don't mention Richard, they all headed for Las Vegas, where they remained for a couple of days before returning to Memphis, without the recording session ever taking place at all. And when Peter says that, it's because it's been rescheduled for September. So this is still August, and when they return in August, the recording session is not taking place. And this is how Peter places Elvis back in Memphis in this time period, and therefore able to be at the Circle G. But we've got a problem here. We have a historical timeline issue that I noticed as I went to put together this story. And I've looked in a lot of different places, and I don't find that anyone has addressed this timeline issue. And what's happened is that between the time that Peter wrote his book almost 30 years ago and today, we've had this wonderful invention called the internet spring up. And we are able to access massive amounts of what would have been very difficult to obtain information in 1998. You would have had to know exactly where to look and find the physical copies of these items. So I have a lot of advantages that Peter never did. But let's take a look at this newspaper article that says singer sued, Santa Monica, California. And this is printed on a Sunday. And it says singer Elvis Presley, because this is from an Australian newspaper, specifically the Canberra Times in Australia. So shout out to Luann, who I know is from Australia. But this was printed in a newspaper over there, and it says singer Elvis Presley is being sued for £223,500 in damages by the widow of a gardener who was killed by Presley's car. American Associated Press said Mrs. Leonie Henslin filed the complaint at the weekend in Santa Monica Superior Court. Richard Davis, 23 years old, who was driving the car, was also named. He was identified as an employee of Presley, who was not in the car at the time of the accident on March 13th. Now, Peter Growlick told us that this accident occurred on August 22nd. Well, we've moved it back to at least March 13th, 1967. Only this particular newspaper was published in 1963. Let's take a look at this one. Santa Monica, California, Elvis faces lawsuit in death of a gardener. And it says the widow of a gardener who was struck and killed by a car on March 13th filed a $501,400 damage suit against rock and roll singer Elvis Presley on Friday. She said Elvis Presley's car killed her husband. Richard E. Davis, 23, identified as an employee of Presley who was driving the car, also was named a defendant by Leona Henslin in her complaint filed in Santa Monica Superior Court. The complaint stated that Harvey Henslin, 45, was walking from the driveway of an employer's home in the Bel Air district when struck by the car. Presley was not an occupant of the car at the time. And Luann says that she remembers the old-fashioned computers from the 80s that looked like a mini TV with a keyboard. They were always cream in color. That's right. That's probably what a very similar machine that Peter used to type his book. But there would have been an early internet, but it wouldn't have had the information available on it. Like these two newspaper articles that I've just shown. And this is the front of the Photoplay magazine, the article that we were looking at. And it's hard to see on this cover. But if you look over at the right-hand side towards the top, it says June. And it happens to be June 1963. And this is a picture of the table of contents for that particular magazine. June 1963 photo play. And here is a blow up of the cover stories, which include Sybil Burton, Sandra Dee, Marilyn Monroe, George Maharis, and Elvis Presley, Errand of Death by Thomas Wheaton, who we were just hearing from. So this incident did not occur in 1967. It absolutely happened on March 13th, 1963. And the last day of filming that is referred to is not Speedway within this article. It's Fun in Acapulco. Now, somehow, as Peter put together his timeline, he became convinced that this event is the reason Elvis canceled his recording sessions in late August of 1967 and had them rescheduled for Nashville in September. And so this is how we are making history right here together. Because we are correcting the timeline that was put astray 30 years ago unintentionally by Peter, who did not have access, it appears, to these source materials, or if he did, he didn't have exact dates. Like maybe he had photocopies, but not the parts with the dates. And Gunn says, how can Elvis be sued when not being in the car and the car was okay and taken care of? Because that's the American way. That we love to sue people over here, and it was becoming very popular in the 1960s. It would have been far less popular in the 50s, but the court systems, business in general, records keeping, it all improved dramatically in the 60s, which allowed for a very litigious environment. And it is absolutely crazy today in America with the people who will sue you and what they will sue you for. But that is a great question, because if you're from the international community, you would probably be like flabbergasted at the way that our civil legal system actually works. But we are correcting the Elvis Presley car accident timeline. And we're looking at the accident that involved Richard Davis, and we're moving it from August 22nd, 67, because we found source material, contemporary articles, and we've moved this to March 13th, 1963, based on the Canberra Times and Photoplay magazine and some others. And Emma says that she has read this book but doesn't remember the accident. She's going to have to reread it now. This is fascinating. Thank you so much, Emma. And you will find it just like I did. He's got it packed into 19... For Peter, this was an important 1967 event. And Peter does not spend much time on 1967. Careless Love, printed in 1968, published in 1968, in its scope. This was Peter Guralnick's widely considered the definitive account of Elvis Presley's later years, and the work is celebrated for its deep research and detailed chronology, serving as a primary reference for historians and fans alike. And the New York Times Book Review said, a monumental work of scholarship. All of these things are true, and nothing that I am saying in this video detracts from Peter's amazing success and the accomplishment of what he did with his two volumes, especially this one. But there is a discrepancy, one specific incident, and it's not the only discrepancy, but in this case, it's one specific incident, a fatal car accident involving an employee, Richard Davis, and it's dated in the book in August 67. And that Guralnick links this tragedy directly to the cancellation of the Los Angeles recording session, suggesting a causal relationship. But we have contemporary press reports from 1963 that challenge this timeline, creating a 4-year gap in the historical record. And why do we have these? Because digital archives have surfaced from 1963. And of course, Peter did not have access to digital archives. And Luann says that over in Australia, they got these laws about suing people too. And Gunn says that that's what she thought, but she didn't know how to ask. Well, you just ask. You can feel free to ask anything. I understand that we're from all over the world in here. And what's amazing is we've all come together and we've got a chance to understand each other as we try to understand Elvis. And Luann says that in Australia, you get sued and it's a lot of money. If you're in the wrong, it could be a lot of cash. That's right. And you don't know if you're in the wrong. They decide that when you get into court. Right? But if you lose, it's a lot of money. Especially if you're Elvis Presley. And Gunn says that this would be some kind of private suit then and not by the police. Absolutely, Gunn. So in America, and I'm not sure how it works in the rest of the world, but we have criminal law, which would be you've broken the law and you will now be punished with jail or prison. Although that system is questionable at this point of time in America about how they're running it. But the other part is civil. And civil is I'm suing another person because I feel they have wronged me. And I believe the law will support that they have wronged me, but it's not a criminal act that they've taken. It's just that they've broken what could be thought of more as rules, but they're laws. And then a judge decides who broke laws the most, because in most of these cases, both people broke the laws. But that's just my opinion, of course. This is an opinion show. And if you have an opinion, feel free to put it in the chat, put it in the comments. If you're amazed that we're correcting Peter Grolnick, even as we celebrate Peter's great successes and the fact that he's brought this to us in the first place so that we even could correct it. So thank you to Peter. But if you think this is amazing, make sure you hit that like button and that you're subscribed and that you tell everybody you know that loves Elvis Presley all about Hillbilly Cat history so that they can come and share these stories with us. And if you're new, this is one of your first videos, I have almost 200 hours of documentaries very much like this. And in every one, I reveal something that's been forgotten about Elvis. But back to this story. Hi, David. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. And Grolnick has said that Tuesday, August 22nd, 1967, that's when this event happened. It caused the Colonel to cancel the recording session. And so the accounts directly linked to the accident and the cancellation. But we looked at the source material, and all of the source material indicates May 13th, 1963. It's from multiple sources. And here are two that are described in the slides. One was a newspaper, one was a magazine. And what this does is force us to shift this story from where Peter thought it was back to where it originally happened. And people knew about it when it originally happened. But in the 30 years between 1963 and 1993, when Peter probably started putting together this book and then printed it in 98, published it in 98, well, this knowledge had been forgotten. And Peter knew the story, but not where it fit. But he knew that this was a major story. So he put it in a spot where it had a major effect. But now we're redating the event. We're decoupling it from Guitar Man in those sessions. We're now questioning what Colonel Parker's role in this was, because he didn't cancel the sessions because of this event. And this reveals that the research methodology that we're using here on the channel is a triangulation value. It demonstrates the critical necessity of verifying secondary source narratives against contemporaneous press and court records. In other words, we got to go back to the source as close as we can get. And that's what I've been consistently trying to bring you here on the channel. And that we're able to do this through digital access, which is a modern blessing. And that hopefully future editions and derivative works of Peter's book will have a revised entry. Maybe that they'll even say, thanks to Hillbilly Cat History, that will point out that this event occurred on March 13th, 1963, and not on August 22nd, 1967. And why primary sources matter? Well, because of this right here. We're able to cut through the fog of the myth, and we're able to see the timeline clearly, and the timeline itself reveals things about Elvis that we never really knew. Just as Peter tried to show a causal relationship, there probably is something that was caused by this, but we'd have to go back to 1963 to look at it. And Alan Fortis says, I don't recall how the lawsuit turned out, but my recollection is that the two parties settled out of court. Mainly, I remember what a number the accident did on Richard, and how he would not drive for a long time. I remember, too, that Elvis insisted we sell the car. So Elvis, he wasn't going to keep this car. It killed a man, and he didn't want it around. And what happened to Richard? Well, after 1963, we've already seen pictures that he stays with Elvis. He's there in 64 for picture of the movie that we looked at a little earlier. He was there in 67 for the wedding. He's been at the Circle G Ranch. He's still here. I'm assuming he's driving again within a couple of years. In 1968, almost exactly a year later from when this event was supposed to have occurred, according to Peter. But if we jump forward to August 5th to August 12th, 1968, we can catch up with Richard Davis. And he's on the set of a television show, and he's filming. He's got a part. And it's Star Trek. And if you look over at the far right-hand side of this picture, you can see Richard Davis in a red shirt. And if we start on the left, we can see Mr. Spock, who is Leonard Nimoy. And then we can see Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura. And DeForest Kelley, who played Dr. McCoy. We can see Jimmy Doohan, who played Mr. Scott. It looks like Walter Koenig, who played Chekhov, his head is turned away, or is down, and we can't see his face. George Takei, who played Mr. Sulu, his face is turned away. We can only see the back of his head, but it's a very distinctive back of the head. There's one other gentleman standing next to Richard who, like Richard, most people would not know his name. I don't know it either. But we can see Richard right here on the set of Star Trek in the episode The Tholian Web. And in this picture from the same episode, we can see Richard Davis at the left. In this scene, Mr. Spock is giving a speech or presentation of some kind, and Richard is searching for a seat so he can sit down and listen. Did you guys know Richard was in Star Trek? Did you know that one of the Memphis Mafia, they walked the corridors of the Enterprise? In this picture on the very far left, he's almost cut off. You can see Richard Davis. He's sitting next to a man in a mustard-colored shirt. Of course, Richard's wearing a red shirt. And here we can see Richard standing. He's on the left again. It's questionable what the man in front of him is doing, but I believe he's sitting down. This is a very good picture of Richard in this particular episode. And this is Richard Davis again. Same scene, really. You can see him in his red shirt amongst all of the Star Trek crew, the crew of the Enterprise. And here's Richard Davis on the bridge. It's like he just came out of the turbo lift. And we've got another view of Richard. Looks like this is the spot where he came into this room to hear Spock's speech. So it kind of looks like maybe he's only in 2 scenes in this particular episode. I think he might have been in more episodes, but this is the only one people have really gone in and found him in. And Gunn says, how did it end then? I think you're referring to the accident. The gardener did pass away. They were sued, or the wife sued Elvis and Richard to try to recoup some financial gain from this loss. Because obviously, she's lost out on a lifetime of earnings through her husband. So it's only right that she does receive something. They settle out of court, according to the sources that we've looked at. Alan Fortas believes they settled out of court, which means they didn't go to court. The attorneys came up with a number, a dollar amount that Elvis paid. And then that closed. They sold the car, and that closed the incident. And Gunn's asking, was Elvis guilty of the man's death? So, from a criminal standpoint, neither Elvis nor Richard was guilty of the man's death. The man stepped out in front of Richard's car. Richard's car was already moving. He struck him. The police found Richard not to be at fault. So there were no charges pressed against Richard, no criminal charges. And of course, there's no criminal charges against Elvis. He wasn't there. And this wasn't a conspiracy or anything to kill this man. It was an accident. So no charges that could be brought. Now, they were found to be responsible, legally responsible. If they had gone to court, I'm sure the judge would have found they were legally responsible to some degree, and that would have determined what they would have had to pay. But instead of going in front of the court, they came to an agreement between themselves that Elvis would pay so much money and the widow would accept it. And then it was all taken care of. And Marion says that it sounds to her as if the Japanese guy wasn't paying enough attention. So why would anyone think that they could get $500,000 when it was truly the gardener's fault? So I think this is similar. If you hit a pedestrian with a car, it doesn't really matter if the pedestrian is breaking the law, like they're jaywalking. The person in the car is always found to be at fault. That's one of the ways our laws work over here. And that doesn't mean a criminal fault, but it means that there may be monetary damages that need to be paid. In other words, you were using your privilege of driving the car on the public roads, and it resulted in the death of another person. And even though it wasn't your fault, in the sense that there was nothing you could have done to save this other person, as with Richard, you're still responsible because you chose to drive the car in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that makes sense, or that's the way the law should be. I believe that's the way the law works here. And again, I'm not a legal expert, so never hire me to be your attorney. That would be a very foolish mistake. But in this case, Elvis made a settlement, and I'm sure he felt terrible about the man, and that it was his car that was involved, and I'm sure he didn't mind paying the money. Because as we saw, when he heard the man was in critical condition, he broke down and cried for the man. And here we can see Richard Davis. There's a fight broke out in this room where they were listening to Spock. And Richard Davis has pulled back. You can see him on the far left. Looks like he's trying not to get hit. It's like there's two guys that are going at each other. And Marion says, is it known if Richard took drugs or alcohol that maybe had to do with this incident or after this incident? Well, I would be fairly positive that Richard is sharing in whatever experiences the other guys are experiencing in. Now, does that mean that he was under the influence at the time of the accident? Cops didn't seem to find it that way. So whatever he was or was not, he wasn't showing any signs of it that led the cops to believe that, or the police to indicate that. At least not that showed up in the newspaper articles. Seems like that would have showed up. And Gunn says, usually it is an insurance company solving the money thing. Yes, that's really what's going on here. The widow has probably sued for more than the insurance company was willing to pay. And if we here in America, we don't have enough coverage for what they believe that they're owed, they can sue you for it. The insurance company will pay off to the maximum of the policy, but you may still be on the line for more if the judgment is found that way. In most cases, judgments aren't going to be found that way because that would kind of destroy the insurance industry and what the state has set as the minimum requirements and all these other things. So usually the insurance companies will work it out. But when you have a name like Elvis Presley involved, well, sky's the limit. You know, they see a large pocket and the lawyers are willing to put a lot of time into that to see if they can't get something from that pocket. Here we can see Richard Davis again at the far left. And another picture of the fight. But I want to rush forward because we're out of time to get to the last one, which is Richard. You can't quite see him, but he's behind the beautiful Nichelle Nichols. So he sat right behind Uhura on the set of Star Trek. And Gunn says that these laws don't make sense, and that it's her opinion, as always. Well, that's the opinion of a lot of people in America as well. Some of these laws don't make any sense at all. And that brings us to the conclusion of this episode. I hope you all enjoyed getting to be a part of Elvis history as we changed the timeline from the top Elvis researcher in the country right now, who just put out a new book. And if you look on YouTube, he just did a brand new interview about that book. And he talks about the Colonel and Elvis. And his new book's all about the Colonel. But until next time, thank you all for coming so much. I appreciated having you all here to share in this discovery in this moment. And I'm going to send you all out of here with a song. And this song will be Truth That Sounds Like Lies. Because if any of this sounded like a lie, it was all the truth. And until I see you all again, y'all keep on taking care of business.
No whisper in the family halls, no doctor's word, no shadow calls. We searched the papers after he was gone. No cancer written, no sickness drawn. Yet silence breaks in fractured skies. Truth that sounds like lies. Charlie spoke with kindness deep, repeating words he thought to keep, protecting Elvis, guarding flame, or echoing voices without a name. A loyal friend, a gentle guide, truth that sounds like lies. Three voices sing in broken time, each one honest, each one blind. The story bends, the rumor flies, truth that sounds like lies. Fracture born of love's disguise, truth that sounds like lies.
At Graceland's door, the doctor came. Vernon ill, his body lame. A secret spoken, hushed and great. Bone cancer spread beyond the grave. I carry words with tearful eyes, truth that sounds like lies.
Cells that look like death's disguise, stained and studied, no disease inside. Not cancers marked, but nature in her body, a breaking, nothing to mend. Science clears, but rumor cries, truth that sounds like lies. Each heart believed what it was told, each hand held fragments, shards of gold. But when the pieces fail to bind, the world calls false what's true inside. Three voices sing in broken time, each one honest, each one blind. The story bends, the rumor flies, truth that sounds like lies. Fracture born of love's disguise, truth that sounds like lies. one's last song. Truth and rumor both belong. A sacred ache beneath the skies. Truth that sounds like lies.